He went to the hospital for a routine procedure. He came home with HIV and hepatitis C, and no idea either of them was in his blood. He didn't know for years, his wife didn't know, his children didn't know. And the Canadian government, the government that had supplied the blood, that had been warned about the contamination, that had received reports telling them exactly what was in the supply, that government didn't tell him either. His name was Randy Connors. He was a hemophiliac. He needed blood products to survive. The blood products he received in the early 1980s were contaminated. The contamination was known. The supply was not pulled. Randy died in 1994. He was 41 years old. He is one of approximately 30,000 Canadians who were infected through the tainted blood supply between 1980 and 1990. Of those, an estimated 8,000 are dead. This is not an accident story. Accidents happen before anyone knows the risk. What happened in Canada's blood supply happened after the risk was known, after warnings were issued, after the United States had already begun pulling contaminated products from its own supply. Canada waited, people died, and then the government spent years making sure nobody found out how much it had known and how long it had waited. Remember Randy, because his story is the story of every person who trusted a system that had already decided their lives were worth less than the cost of fixing it. Canada's blood supply in the early 1980s was managed by the Canadian Red Cross. The Red Cross collected blood from donors, processed it into blood products, and distributed those products to hospitals across the country. It was a system that Canadians trusted completely. The Red Cross was one of the most respected humanitarian organizations in the world. Its involvement in the blood supply felt like a guarantee of safety. It was not a guarantee, it was an assumption, and the assumption was wrong. The blood products most critical to hemophiliacs, people whose blood does not clot properly and who require regular infusions of clotting factors to survive, were manufactured from pooled plasma. Plasma from thousands of donors, combined into a single batch, processed into a concentrated product. The mathematics of pooled plasma meant that a single infected donor could contaminate an entire batch, and a single batch reached hundreds of patients. In the early 1980s, HIV was a new virus. Its presence in the blood supply was not immediately understood. But by 1982, there were reports in medical literature suggesting that the virus could be transmitted through blood products. By 1983, the evidence was strong enough that the United States Food and Drug Administration was recommending that blood collection agencies screen donors and implement safety measures. Canada received those reports. The Canadian Red Cross received those recommendations. The federal government's Bureau of Biologics received the warnings. What happened next is the part that transformed this from a tragedy into a scandal. Between 1982 and 1985, the Canadian Red Cross received multiple warnings about the safety of its blood supply. Internal memos, documents that would eventually be uncovered by the Crever Commission inquiry, show that officials within the Red Cross knew that the pooled plasma products were potentially contaminated. They knew that heat treatment of blood products could inactivate HIV. They knew that the United States was moving toward implementing heat treatment and donor screening. They did not implement heat treatment immediately. They did not pull the existing contaminated stock. They continued to distribute blood products that they had reason to believe might be infected. The reasons documented in those internal memos are not mysterious. Heat treatment was expensive. Pulling existing stock was expensive. Implementing new donor screening protocols was expensive and administratively complex. The cost of the contamination, paid not in dollars but in lives, was not entered into that calculation, or it was entered and was found to be acceptable. That is the sentence that defines the Canadian tainted blood scandal. The cost in lives was found to be acceptable, not by monsters, not by people who wanted hemophiliacs to die, by administrators and officials and bureaucrats who were managing a supply chain and a budget and a set of institutional priorities, and who decided, in the specific way that institutions make these decisions, that the risk was manageable. The people who died from that decision were not in the room when it was made. HIV was not the only pathogen in the tainted blood supply. Hepatitis C, a virus that was not fully identified and characterized until 1989, was also present in the pooled plasma products distributed to Canadian patients throughout the 1980s. The hepatitis C infections were, in some ways, even more insidious than the HIV infections. Hepatitis C produces few immediate symptoms. It can live in the body for decades before producing serious liver damage, cirrhosis, liver failure, liver cancer. People infected in the early 1980s did not know they were infected. They went about their lives. They had children. They had relationships. They went to doctors for unrelated conditions and were not tested for a virus that was destroying their livers from the inside. The full scale of the hepatitis C contamination in Canada's blood supply was not established until the Crever Commission began its work in the mid-1990s. By that time, tens of thousands of Canadians had been living with the infection for over a decade without knowing. The treatment available for hepatitis C in the 1990s was limited and had significant side effects. The treatment available today is far more effective, but it came decades after the infection. For many of those infected, the liver damage done over those decades was not reversible. Stay with me. Because what came next, the cover-up, the destroyed documents, the government's response, is what makes this a dark Canada story. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the scale of the contamination began to become apparent, documents began to disappear. Internal Red Cross memos, Bureau of Biologics correspondence, records of meetings where the contamination risk had been discussed and decisions had been made not to act. The paper trail that would have established who knew what and when. That paper trail developed significant gaps at precisely the moments when it would have been most incriminating. Some documents were shredded. Some were lost in circumstances that were never adequately explained. Some were withheld from the Crever Commission under claims of legal privilege that the Commission spent years contesting. The Canadian Red Cross, the organization that Canadians had trusted with their blood supply, that had distributed the contaminated products, that had received the warnings and not acted, hired lawyers, lots of lawyers, and those lawyers spent years managing what information the Commission could access and what it could not. The federal and provincial governments, which had regulatory responsibility for the blood supply and had failed to exercise it, also lawyered up. The people most responsible for what had happened were the people with the most resources to control what the inquiry found. The Crever Commission ultimately produced a report, released in 1997, that was comprehensive, damning, and specific. It named names. It identified decisions. It described, in detail, the gap between what was known and what was done. The government's response was to accept the report's recommendations and contest its findings. Simultaneously, Justice Horace Crever spent 5 years conducting the inquiry into Canada's tainted blood scandal. What he found was not a single catastrophic failure. It was a series of decisions, small decisions, institutional decisions, budget decisions, that accumulated into a catastrophe. No single person had decided to poison 30,000 Canadians. The outcome had emerged from a system in which nobody's specific job was to prevent it. The Red Cross had prioritized supply continuity over safety. The Bureau of Biologics had prioritized deference to the Red Cross over regulatory oversight. The provincial governments had prioritized cost containment over quality assurance. The federal government had prioritized avoiding confrontation with the Red Cross over protecting the public. Each institution had done what institutions do, protected its own interests, managed its own risk, deferred to others when action would have been costly. The people who died had no institutional interests. They had no lawyers. They had no budget for managing risk. They had a blood supply they trusted and a government they trusted to make sure it was safe. Justice Crever recommended that those responsible be named publicly and that criminal charges be considered. The government agreed to the report's policy recommendations. It went to court to prevent the naming. The institutions that had failed protected themselves. The people they had failed were already dead. The compensation process for tainted blood victims in Canada is one of the most protracted and inadequate in the country's history. HIV-infected recipients received compensation in the late 1980s after sustained public pressure and advocacy by victims' groups. The amounts were contested. The process was adversarial. Many recipients were too ill to navigate it. Hepatitis C victims waited longer. The federal and provincial governments initially offered compensation only to those infected between 1986 and 1990, excluding people infected before 1986 on the grounds that the risk was not known, and people infected after 1990 on the grounds that the system should have been fixed by then. The people infected before 1986, when the warnings were already present in the medical literature, were excluded from compensation on the grounds that the risk was not sufficiently established at that time. The people who had been told their infections predated official knowledge of the risk spent years fighting a government that was using the timeline of its own inaction as a legal defense. Eventually, after years of litigation and advocacy, compensation was extended. In 2024, 40 years after the contamination, the federal government announced a new compensation framework for all tainted blood survivors. 40 years. For people who had spent those 40 years with HIV and hepatitis C in their blood, with damaged livers, with the knowledge that they had been infected by a system that knew the risk and calculated that fixing it was too expensive. Randy Connors did not live to see 2024. Neither did 8,000 others. The Canadian Red Cross no longer manages the blood supply. Following the Crever Commission, the blood system was restructured. Canadian Blood Services was created to replace the Red Cross in managing the supply. New safety protocols were implemented. The system that had distributed contaminated blood for a decade was dismantled and rebuilt. The rebuilding was real. The new system is safer. The reforms that came out of the Crever Commission produced genuine improvements in how Canada manages its blood supply. None of that brought Randy Connors back. None of it restored the liver function of the tens of thousands infected with hepatitis C. None of it gave back the decades that people spent sick, dying, or fighting a government that spent years managing its legal liability rather than acknowledging its responsibility. Canada rebuilt its blood system. What it has never fully rebuilt is the trust that the scandal destroyed, the trust that the people who run the systems we depend on are making their decisions with our lives as the primary consideration rather than their budgets, their institutions, and their legal exposure. That trust, once broken in this specific way, by documented evidence that the risk was known and the calculation was made and the lives were found acceptable losses, does not rebuild with a new agency name and an updated safety protocol. It rebuilds, if it rebuilds at all, with honesty, with full disclosure, with the acknowledgement that the people who died were not acceptable losses, that the decision that treated them as such was wrong, not unfortunate, not a product of the limitations of the time, wrong. Canada has not fully said that, not in those words, not without qualification. This is dark Canada, where the blood finally gets accounted for, and the people who were found acceptable losses get named. Subscribe. Because the tainted blood scandal is not the only time Canada calculated that some lives were worth less than the cost of protecting them. And we are not done counting.